In Argentina, on the other hand, where I don't have time really to develop this, which has also experienced savage cuts in energy, which means the lights have gone out in Buenos Aires and many of the cities of Latin America in the recent period, they have also experienced a growth rate of, according to the Economist newspaper, of 33% in the course of the last 5 years. And yet, if you cast your mind back to 2001, 2002, such was the devastating crisis in Buenos Aires that the sons, the daughters, the granddaughters and grandsons of immigrants from Spain and Italy were queuing up outside of the embassies of these countries, wanting to return back to Spain and Italy because of the catastrophic situation in terms of inflation, the collapse of the economy, and so on. And last but not least, by the way, in Brazil in 1980-81, 7 million people went from the middle class to the working class in the space of 12 months to 18 months. They are just two indications of how fragile is the economic situation in these countries and how quickly the masses, from apparent growth and expectations of a better future, can be sunk into terrible poverty as a whole. Latin America, as with the neo-colonial world as a whole, will be affected by the world economic crisis which is developing at the moment. I won't go into that. That will be dealt with in the next session, dealing with the world economy and with Britain. And remember, this comes on top of the experiences of the 1980s, which was a lost decade of low growth, no expectations of a brighter future, and so on. That was followed, as with Britain, as with capitalist world as a whole, but with a devastating effect in Latin America, to the mass privatization, in which it was expected, well, we've tried everything else, was the argument. We've tried nationalization. We've tried a mixed economy. Let's go in for the hidden hand of the market, as Adam Smith expressed it. And mass privatizations took place in Latin America. As a matter of fact, more painful for the masses, because it was really selling off native industry, built up very carefully over decades, over 100 years in some cases, sold off to the highest bidder, which was imperialist firms abroad. And paradoxically, you had Spanish multinationals which really bought up whole chunks of industry in the different countries of Latin America. And as the masses expressed it, it was the return of the conquistadors to Latin America in a slightly different fashion today. That led to the huge recoil, social, economic and political recoil, that is unfolding in Latin America with such dramatic effect at the present time. Because we now have this particularly expressed in what the bourgeois strategists themselves refer to as the arc of instability, in the Andean arc of instability, which takes in Venezuela, Bolivia and Ecuador. But I want to stress, it's not just in these countries. They are an anticipation, and in the long run, not necessarily the most important as far as the Latin American landmass is concerned. Now, Venezuela, I think most of the comrades in this room know about the broad developments in Venezuela. It hasn't touched to the same extent the great majority of the population. For instance, today, the developments taking place in Venezuela are not as dramatic as the effects that the older generation, particularly here today, will remember what happened at the time of the dramatic events in Chile from 1970 to 1973, which ended, of course, in a civil war, in effect, in the seizure of power of the Pinochet regime and the dark night of what, 20,000 workers who were annihilated in Chile at that particular time. And why that caught the ear and the eye and the imagination of the working class internationally is they could see the working class acting as the main social force in the Chilean revolution. Unfortunately, because of the social makeup and because of the character of the way that the movement has developed, it has not yet had the same effect as Chile did in 70 to 73. Nevertheless, if you were to look at most politically conscious working class people today, especially young people who are looking for an alternative, and especially, by the way, in the neo-colonial world, after the horrors of privatization, they would look towards what is taking place in Venezuela at the moment. And for that reason, the developments taking place there are very important for us, for socialists and Marxists. In a way, it's a laboratory test between the ideas that we put forward and the ideas that other currents of thought in the workers' movement advance at the present time. And the first point we have to say is that in Venezuela, we have at least in the last 9 years, because it's taken a period of 9 years, of the features of a revolution. And what is a revolution? The most distinguishing feature of a revolution is when the masses, who up to in the normal period are merely the playthings of leaders, of parties and so on, when the working class independently, or the masses in this sense, step onto the scene of history and begin to try and take their own fate into their hands. Rob mentioned before the kind of anniversaries that we're celebrating in private conversation. He mentioned in his opening remarks. We shouldn't forget that we're celebrating this year one of the greatest events in working class human history, and that was the May events of 1968 in France. The greatest general strike in history, when 10 million workers reached out for the power. You could say they took the ruling class by the throat, and the leaders of the Communist and Socialist parties took their fingers away and allowed capitalism to be re-established. That's another discussion. I won't go into that today. But that feature of working class people stepping onto the scene, begin to fashion their own fate, is one of the unmistakable signs of a revolution, or in this case you have to say a revolutionary process. Now Chavez developed his ideas not in isolation. Remember, he started off in believing in humane capitalism. He wanted to render capitalism more humane. There's no such a thing, by the way. It's like trying to take out the claws of a tiger, a very dangerous job, which is likely to mean that you be injured more than the tiger. There's no possibility of making what is essentially a system based on production for profit and not for social need, to make that system humane as Chavez expected. But under the impact of events, particularly the coup earlier in this decade, the attempted coup of the right, he was freed not by army officers, but by a spontaneous movement of the masses that compelled the regime to free Chavez. He in turn was affected by that, and was in turn affected by the developments. It was he gave a certain impetus by attacks on capitalism. When the reaction acted on a number of occasions, he was radicalized. And he's ended up in the situation where he now puts forward, Trotsky was a great man, and that's a great step forward for Marxism in Latin America, because up to now it's been under the banner of Stalinism or reformism, and Trotsky was condemned as an agent of imperialism. So for Chavez to talk about the great historic role of Trotsky is a plus, is a big step forward. He's mentioned Trotsky's transitional program of 1938 as one of the best documents ever produced by any workers' leader in history. He's also spoken about the importance of the permanent revolution of Trotsky, of the idea of the bourgeois democratic tasks of the revolution in the neo-colonial world, of a land reform, of solving the national question, of freedom from imperialism, is impossible in the neo-colonial world without posing the task of the socialist revolution as well. So all of these are enormously progressive from our point of view and are a great step forward. He interprets that, unfortunately, in a reformist fashion, in the sense that he sees the permanent revolution as a series of stages rather than the working class taking power, solving the bourgeois democratic revolution, and then going over to the tasks of the socialist revolution on a national scale to begin with, and then from an international point of view.